You should have listened to your friend.
Welcome back, nerds. Fino here with a guide for Artoria Pendragon Castor, aka Castoria. Or as you're legally required to call her in NA, Castria. Sounds like a European word for getting your nuts on off. She's a new limited support of Castor introduced in Fate Grand Order's 5th anniversary, and her addition has opened Pandora's box on the slumbering Arts archetype. Before this point, Arts teams tended to occupy a distant second place in terms of farming, behind the waiver-fueled Buster teams of old, and then the more recent Scotty Quick meta. You'd have oddball nodes where Arts teams would shine through, but there'd be a lot of fuckery in getting them to work, like using Paracelsus in Wave 1, which is its own can of worms due to its atrocious damage, or abusing flat chargers like Rider Da Vinci. The core problem was the lack of a card-type specific 50% charger. Tamamo had card-type and NP damage buffs, and in long, slogging fights, her cooldown reduction could make a fearsome engine. But outside of her NP, she gives 0 charge. Nero Bright, on the other hand, could give 30% charge, which was a step in the right direction, but not quite enough to make a convenient system. Among other things, she likes an arts buff. The point was that arts farming was a huge pain in my ass, and I avoided it unless I had no better alternative, like with OG Seraph for the Las Vegas event, where you could have more than 3 enemies per wave. But that's all in the past. Once you establish your roster of attackers, farming is as simple as running 2 Castorias, dumping their buffs on your DPS, and pressing the big blue button. Let's take a look under the hood to see exactly what we're working with. Charisma of Hope is a party-wide attack buff that also gives 30% charge across the board. That extra 10% over other party chargers is a huge convenience since it means you can activate Castoria's NP with a generic 50% charge CE like Golden Catches the Carp or Dragon's Meridian. Even lower if you have 40% CEs or you're willing to level up Castoria's Load Magical Energy Append skill for extra starting charge. That's her only notable append skill, by the way. You just need 20% charge from something that's not Castoria. Craft Essence, Arts Chain, take your pick. Next up is Protection of the Lake. It's a 20% targeted charge that also buffs your team's NP gain. Obviously, you target your main attacker with this. It has a 5-turn cooldown, which means that in longer engagements, it'll be the first of her skills to come back up. Usually I just pop it again immediately to get those effects, but keep in mind that Castoria's other skills have 6-turn cooldowns, and over time, they'll drift apart if you do that. In these situations, you'll have to make a judgment call on whether you can afford to wait an extra turn to re-establish your loop. Finally, we have Sword of Selection. It's a targeted arts buff that also gives damage against threat to humanity enemies and 1 turn of invuln. Generally, the threat to humanity thing tends to apply to foreigners and a number of Lost Belt 6 bosses, not really relevant to farming outside of some oddball situations. As for the invuln, that's more relevant for its second application once it comes off cooldown. Initially, you dump both arts buff onto your main attacker and just let the extra invuln go to waste. Now, there is a way to min-max this if your attacker has taunt. They can just taunt themselves and draw damage away from the 2 Castorias on turn 1. After that, you put it on your main attacker if you can, and a Castoria if you absolutely need her to survive an extra turn, usually to get her NP off. Speaking of which, Castoria's Noble Phantasm is a Round Caliburn or Round of Avalon depending on her ascension. The difference is purely cosmetic like with Okita J Soji. You got 3 effects. First is a party-wide debuff cleanse. Handy for challenge quests, though I have to point out that due to the game's programming, you can't sequence around Caliburn into a sealed NP, even though the NP seal would be removed by the time it's activated. You physically can't pick the relevant card. It's dumb. The second effect is an attack buff tied to Castoria's NP level. You gain an additional 10% going from NP 1 to 2, with diminishing returns after that. Having a high NP level is nice, but not necessary for typical farming teams, so you'll have to do your own math on that one. Around Caliburn's final effect is a party-wide super invuln tied to overcharge. Each level of overcharge adds 1 hit. It's listed in the tooltip as anti-enforcement defense state or something, but I'll just call it super invuln for convenience. What makes this so special is that it's an invulnerability buff that ignores invuln pierce. An invuln ignoring defense buff, if you will. In some boss battles, enemies gain full meter on bar break and hit you with an invuln pierce boosted NP. Before this, your options were to eat it, use massive defense buffs, or try and debuff the enemy to soften the blow. Unless you were running someone like Munenori, these weren't really conducive to a fast kill. But what Castoria can do is pop around Caliburn just before the big hit to parry it, while you keep your momentum from having a looping attacker. It's very convenient. Now there are some technical aspects to consider. There's a trade-off between getting more stacks and having the attack buff for your main attacker's NP, depending on whether you put around Caliburn first or second on your chain. If you're reaching for a bar break, you do the former. If you're afraid of getting double tapped, you do the latter. Then you have to consider overcharge CEs. There are 2 that stand out. Firstly, Devilish Bodhisattva gives starting charge and 1 stack of boosted overcharge. If you need extra super invulns right away, you go with this. Second is One Who Wishes for Salvation. It has no starting charge but lets you get additional overcharge up to 4 times, meaning it's the better option for longer fights. In situations where you don't need constant charge from Prisma Cosmos, the reduced cost of Dragon's Meridian, or stars from Golden Catches the Carp or 2030, these are the go-to CEs for Castoria. This kit is very strong, there's no denying it. In fact, some people have gotten it into their head that Castoria works as a genre replacement. I think that's fundamentally misunderstanding their respective strengths. Castoria is an accelerator for your big damage dealer who can also parry retaliatory mechanics. As a fight gets deeper and you exhaust your CE's effect, you usually won't be getting more than 100% overcharge at a given time. This means you'll eventually block an NP, but none of the follow-up attacks. This combined with Castoria's lack of healing or defense buffs means she has a tendency to get chipped out in longer fights. You can mitigate this to an extent by running her with someone like Tamamo, Mash, Anderson, or even Merlin, but that complicates team building when you usually just want to run 2 Castorias and keep your backline flexible. Well, I guess a Tamamo Castoria frontline is an effective compromise, depending on your main attacker, of course. Seems like the old ways aren't dead just yet. Now, if I had to own one or the other, I'd take Castoria, but there are still situations where Jeanne will outperform her. If you don't need to resist Invuln Pierce, if a fight's guaranteed to take a long time, if you need to solo something that's not a Zerk or Avenger, in these situations, she can grind them out with NP spam and the ruler class's defensive advantage. Jeanne may have a turbo trash skill 2 and a situational skill 3, but she still has effective niches and you shouldn't forget that. Trust me, I tried running Castoria as a Jeanne replacement on JP and it's not as cut and dry as you'd like. With that out of the way, let's talk farming. The rule of thumb is that you want attackers with some combination of generous hit counts, batteries, strong buffs, and a lack of preemptive instant kill. This means Assassin Nidacris, Utsumi Erisei, and Saber Shiki are immediately out. Some functional highlights include Melt Lancer, the future Muramasa, Space Ishtar, John Archer, Sieg, and Zerk Sashi. Got some Finn McCool rotting in the second archive? Guess what? He works too, and pretty well at that. Not as good as Melt, but still. If you're wondering whether a specific servant can loop, I'd recommend Xnaya's video on Castoria system attackers. I use it as a quick reference if I'm ever in doubt. Sorry, arts reference. Though, truth be told, I really just use one attacker on JP. The old Gongmeister. I already did an extensive video on him, but the TLDR is that if you already have a lot of 50% chargers, you can save a lot of quartz on attackers by grailing Chen Gong, a free 2-star servant. Castoria's introduction is the tipping point that makes him a viable Omni attacker. As for single target synergies, you've got apocalyptic power picks like Squirturia, but truth be told, I take advantage of whatever's on hand, even if they can't loop. Welfares like Hagatora, Chloe, Bibi, and Hokusai benefit greatly in terms of damage and reliability. Even kinda mediocre ones like Ride at Ryoma become effective beatsticks with Castoria steroids. It's also worth noting that with her buff, Assassin Shiki can compete with Kama at killing riders despite having far worse fundamentals. The gap in power between Shiki and Kama is in large part bridged by the inverse gap between Castoria and Skadi. One of the biggest perks with Castoria teams is that you can run 6 event CEs. Your attackers aren't married to K-Scope, and unless your NP level is low enough to require Black Grail or a 50% CE for a tricky Zerk node, it doesn't really matter what you run. Now there is a downside. You can't necessarily rely on Castoria teams for 90+ nodes since they have irregular enemy counts and that messes up refund values. Unless of course you're using Chen Gong, who doesn't really care about enemy counts and can farm anything outside of the most sadistic nodes. But for most lottery farming, you can just 6-slot your way to the bank, even if you have to do the 90 node instead. But if you're gonna do a lot of hard farming, you may want to check your settings, because Castoria's skill animations are actually slower in her 3rd ascension. So if you're trying to min-max your farming speed in lottery events or hunting quests, you should put her in stage 1 or 2. This isn't an issue on JP since they have skill skip, but we don't yet. Until that time, the cool ascension with all the swords is actually the worst one. Oh, fun fact, Castoria has a secret 4th passive which gives her 20% crit chance resistance. This kinda mitigates her problem of accumulating chip damage, but you get it after clearing Lost Belt 6, which is where the actual chipping happens the most. Ain't that a stinker? Suffice to say, Castoria is amazing, and if you have even the slightest interest in art servants, you should get at least 1 copy immediately. She's an absolute game changer, and this arts meta is gonna be the go-to for whales for some time to come, so get in early and reap the benefits. But what if I want to stick with Quick, I hear you say? Well, your life is about to get a lot harder. Another JP feature we currently lack is deep support lists, which let people run multiple servants in the same class slot. So given the choice between Castoria and Skadi, most people will opt to run the former, meaning you'll have to curate your friends list specifically for Skadi if you want to stay the course, so have fun with that. Thanks for watching, lads. I'll be streaming some sort of FGO gacha on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday this week, and on Thursday I have a special Castoria catalyst that I'm cooking up just for the main event. So stop on by to see some serious memes and dreams alike. 3 PM Pacific time each day. You won't want to miss it.